ladies first, let me first introduce Tripura, who is representing the Organizations Hub today. She will help us asking the questions and guide us through the panel that we're going to have. The purpose of our event today is to encourage deeper reflection on how organizations and communities evolve. We're going to explore that. We're going to make people engage, and hopefully we have a lot of fun. And I think, Joss, you all know as the head of systems innovation. So let me introduce Fabian Pfortmüller. Fabian is our guest today, and we're going to ask him lots of questions. Fabian has been implementing a network called Sandbox that he might talk about a little bit to us as we go. And he basically evolved in his work the idea of community and focused on that in various moments. And he's currently working, and he's the co-founder at the Together Institute. And the Together Institute, that is all about community, is stewarding a project which is called Community Weaving, which we had shared on the platform. And I think he's going to talk a lot about that idea, everything about creating, enabling, weaving communities together, as he says. So look for that material. It has very beautiful drawings and lots of canvases. Thank you for posting it. And before I hand it over to Fabian, if you look at the Miro board, we would like you to post where you're actually from so that we have an idea. So please go ahead, and please also put a little effort, a little comment in the stickies right underneath, where we're trying to stimulate the conversation around, if you were starting a community-driven organization, what's the first thing you would focus on? So think about that for a little while, put something into the sticky, and then as we go and you have questions, please put them in the chat, and we will see in the course of the panel conversation when we can address them. We will try find the right moment. So maybe we take a breath, or the speakers take a little breath, and we then ask the questions, but we see how we're going to handle that. And maybe you can even speak up at some moment. So welcome Tripura, welcome Joss, and very big welcome and applause for Fabian. The floor is yours. And Fabian, you might actually want to introduce yourself, because maybe I got all these names wrong, and you can make a much better introduction of yourself.
No, I think Bernd, you did a great job. So I think I think this is perfect. So maybe Tripura, did you wanna weave us forward?
Yeah, sure. So welcome Fabian and Joss, Bernd, and everyone on this session today. This is great, and it's an interesting topic. So without further ado, I'll jump right into the questions. So Fabian, help us understand, what does it mean for organizations to be more like communities?
Yeah, sure. I can start with that. So I think it's when we talk about communities, it's probably good to talk about what we mean by communities. And what I can offer you is not that definition, because community means many different things to many different people, which is actually one of the challenges of working with community, that it just is so, it can mean so many different things. But the definition that we work with, which is informed by doing community work for the past 20 plus years, is that community is a web of relationships around a shared purpose. Community is a web of relationships around a shared purpose. So there's two elements in our definition that make community community. One is there's relationships, there's a cluster, there's a web of relationships, and there's some kind of shared purpose, or sometimes we even talk about possibility. There's some kind of shared possibility in the middle. And so when we think about what can communities learn, or what can organizations? Oh yeah, okay, maybe I'll go there. I see Omar's question: are community and network the same? Great question. Another term that is very vague is network. And we like to work with a quote by Henry Mintzberg, an author, that said, communities care, networks connect, or the other way around. I think it's networks connect, communities care. So what we like to think of is like relationships exist on a spectrum, where on one side of the spectrum, you have really deep relationships of love and solidarity and friendship. And on the other side, you have more transactional relationships, more consumer relationships, maybe also to some extent, maybe more employment relationships to some extent, which we can look at after. And I think, again, in the way we work with this term, for us, we basically just choose to use these terms where we look at community as something that's more on the side of deeper relationships, and network that's something more on connection. But what the quality is of that connection is not that defined. And Joss, I see you unmuted, so I'd love to bring in your voice and perspective.
Yeah, well, I think definitely there's lots of different interpretations of the term, isn't there? Community, and it's a big idea. You can come from many different dimensions, but you talk about evolving organizations to be more like communities. What's the relationship there? And one thing that really interested me in this conversation is that kind of creative tension between the two. And what are the connotations of an organization when we say that word? Organization implies this thing does something, doesn't it? It's organized in a particular way to do something. So it's kind of a system, has all these elements, interrelationships, and it has some kind of structure. Typically, when you say organization, you mean like structure, and this thing's going to do stuff in the world, right? So that's kind of the connotation when you say organization. We say community, the connotations are a bit different, aren't they? You talk about relationships, you talk about the quality of those relationships. There's also something kind of holistic about that concept that isn't really there when you talk about organization. There's a sense of togetherness, like your institute's called, right? And kind of being together that isn't necessarily an organization. You think about organization, it's like we're going to do something together, like we're here to work, you know, and there's a structure within which we organize ourselves towards a productive end. But a community doesn't, the word itself doesn't really connote, it doesn't necessarily say that. You say it has a purpose typically, yes, but the question then is this thing able to do something? That's the interesting question I have, right? Because in our world, it's a lot that organizations are the one that deliver our products, our services, and they're the ones that govern us. And then the tension is, well, could they be more like communities? But the struggle with communities is maybe they're too good at just being together sometimes and working on the quality of their relationships, as valuable as that is. But can we actually get communities that are productive in the way that organizations are is partly the tension I'm playing with here that I think is really interesting. And we know that organizations, well, we think they do need to be more like communities because we know the relationships in organizations, in a lot of our organizations, is not very good quality, is it, right? It's often hierarchical and so forth. And I think it's that question of, could we get synergies? Could we get, you know, the best of both of those kind of systems in terms of organizations that have that holistic aspect of being together and the quality of the relationships, but also they're very productive. They're able to deliver our products and services, our housing and all of this thing. So that's the kind of aspect I pick up on, and why I think it's a really interesting conversation. And I think it's one that's kind of playing out in the world that we see. A lot of people in organizations, I hear it all around me here, they aren't very happy, right? And they're very transactional. They leave as soon as they could, really, a lot of people, right? They have no sense of community. They have no sense of real relationships there, you know? So we know there's something really missing in our world, and we know communities have a lot of those things that are missing. So how can we integrate those and evolve and transition towards maybe more decentralized, more community-based systems that are also productive? They're not just about being in and of themselves.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating starting point. And what I would say there is that let's talk about which organizational structure, community is also kind of an organizational structure in the end, is more productive or creates more. And what I've come to see is that if you have a very specific outcome you want to drive, you know what the problem is you want to solve, and you know basically you want to really target that kind of outcome, I think hierarchical organizations are way better than communities to get that done. I think what I have seen though is that communities are amazing at unlocking agency at a much bigger scale. What I mean by that is that in most organizations, people are there because they are paid to be there, because they have a contract to be there. And there is, of course, there's people are not forced to be there in that traditional sense, but in the end of the day, their agency is limited. What they get to do might be predefined, might come top down, while communities drive basically on people's intrinsic motivation to do things. And what I've experienced is that, again, like if you as a community have something very specific in mind, it might not get done. But if you have an intention, a direction that's not like just like very, very narrow, but you have a shared intention and you invite people's agency to unlock, and often is around allowing people to find their own ways to fulfill their purpose, to be in service of that intention. There's so much energy and agency that can be unlocked. But the time scale is very different. I think if I can bet on a community to do things over a time scale over 10 years, whatnot, versus an organization, and if I'm willing to look at like how can it holistically like support a field, I think communities have a real competitive edge. But again, like if there's a specific outcome to drive, I think they're not very, very good at that. And I think one thing to explore maybe as part of our conversation is like, yeah, what could be like mixed models to kind of, you know, tap into one or the other.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say briefly, and then we'll give back to Tripura. But yeah, part of the problem is you get so many communities that bubble up, don't they? And they definitely don't last 10 years, right? So that's something I'd love to touch upon as we go along. But yeah, I'll pass it back to Tripura.
Yeah. So we touched a little bit on this, but you know, what are some of the practices that can help organization function more like communities?
I could start if you want, Fabian. Yeah, good question. I think pick up on what Fabian was saying. You know, the communities are good at some things, not necessarily very focused things, right? So are there things in your organization that needs cultivating and growing over time in a more holistic and relational sort of way? One kind of case study I find interesting is the United Nations. And I think we know it's quite a bureaucratic system and challenging as a structure that's not really evolving in the way that we need it to evolve, right? But the pockets of lights I see in the UN system are the communities of practice, the innovation communities of practice, where people get together across the whole UN system to you know, develop their practice and capacity and ideas around innovation. And they're starting to talk about, you know, the UN 2.0, which is the next evolution of the UN, and how they might move in that direction. So I think it's that, I mean, communities of practice are such good examples of communities within organizations, aren't they? Even if they never ultimately transform the entire enterprise and take it to a new level, they are examples where the enterprise sees, yeah, we need this thing. It's actually of some value to us, right? And it's cross-cutting, it's across the enterprise, it's connecting all different people and helping them co-learn and potentially co-create around something they share. I would question, do they get to that stage of co-create, right? Often it's just coming together for learning and then they go back to their boxes to do all the doing, right? And we know they rarely actually transform that enterprise to something new, but they are good little case studies in and of themselves. So maybe I'll pass it over to Fabian there.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful example, Joss. With, for example, with like the internal communities within like a large organization like the UN. I think what's one of the I think the learning part is really powerful. I do think there is just, again, I think there's something what you were saying to Joss before, that there's a lot of value in simply creating a web of relationships within organizations. Even just we categorize, like we basically bucket what is the value that communities create. We very like roughly like put into 3 buckets. One is being together, simply being in deeper relationships, having relationships of care, trust, love, belonging. One is learning together. We talked communities of practice, and then one is doing together. And I do think that just simply having smaller circles of connection would increase, I think, a lot of the quality of being, the well-being, as well as the happiness, I think, of a lot of people in organizations. Joss spoke about, I think, the communities of practice and the learning opportunities. And I think for me, one of the biggest opportunities with communities within organizations is also what Joss spoke to. And I'll say the same thing, maybe in slightly different terms, which is that I think one of the most beautiful characteristic of communities is that they can embody values that are different from the norm around them. What I mean by that is that a community can choose to embody certain values, and it starts often with the people who begin them. And as such, they can be little islands, little bubbles, little futures, little bubbles of different futures. Let's say if an organization wants to become more innovative, how do you make an organization of 20,000 people more innovative? Well, what if you can create little islands where there a culture of innovation is practiced, where it's maybe a little bit more encouraged to take risk, where it's a little safer to take risk? And then what if these like, you know, more and more islands start to connect, and it becomes like a field of resonance? And I also like the idea of resonance, like kind of like that culture resonating out. And I see that as a huge opportunity, because I'm no expert on culture change within organizations, but if I were in charge of doing that, my feeling would be to do it through fractals, through many different groups within that start to play with, and most importantly, practice and embody this different kind of culture. Because culture, I think, if someone tells you you should change and become this, I don't know if that works. And yeah, and I think that's a real big opportunity.
That's great. Joss, you want to say something more on this?
Yeah, I did just want to pick up on that. Sorry, I was on mute. I think it goes to then also the tension, doesn't it? Because if you're having communities in organizations, right, there's then that tension, isn't there? And the whole change management thing in organizations, how top down it is, right? When really what's needed is growing things in these little pockets, doesn't it? But how difficult it's going to be for senior management to see those things and say, that's our future, and that's what we should be growing, and that's what we should be building, instead of getting consultants to do our transformation kind of program. And you might say, like, that's the only way real change can happen, or ever has happened, because all change must start with someone, you know, as you say, a different culture, embodying different values, ideas, and different culture. And then that's inevitably going to go to a small group, isn't it? Or that's the way that's going to grow. So it's the natural way that you grow and evolve new cultures and new ideas within society, within organizations, and so forth. But then I guess the question is, well, are communities only for small things like that? Or when those develop and grow, can the whole enterprise be a community? As you say, the fractal thing, which is really interesting, right? Can they be these small communities that's organized through a network in productive ways to actually do this stuff at a larger scale, so that we don't end up in a world of, yes, lots of little communities, but when they get big, they turn into these monstrous enterprises, right? Is there a way to actually innovate and disrupt that whole kind of paradigm so that you can have these larger organisms that are very productive, but not organized in that very rigid way. They're flexible micro communities with that kind of fractal structure you talk about, Fabian.
Yeah, and if I may, that very much resonates, and I want to would add, I think that tension between, for me, there's a fundamental tension around agency, and let's imagine like there's large organizations, these communities become stronger and stronger, maybe bigger and bigger. At what point is it just a nice to have within the organization that's kind of like here on the side? Or at one point does the organization really accept, invite the agency of those groups to help shape the organization? At one point, is it like is it just a separate entity, or is it really like is it kind of accepted as something that is allowed to shape the overall organizations? And I imagine that's where in current models, a lot of these things kind of clash. And I would say, I think what I've seen in my experience with like internal communities, you were speaking to that just before too, is that a lot of communities don't get to age because often there is no sustained, it doesn't only have to do with funding, it has to do with many factors, but often the resourcing is not there in a sustained way for these groups to continue to exist. And one small detail or manifestation of that is that a lot of the internal communities I know and I've worked with, their community work is expected to be a voluntary thing on top of their work. It's basically like people have to do it in their free time. And that's not how you would treat it if you think that is of actual value what's being created, if you see of it as a like strategic investment of energy and time.
Yeah, just one quick point there. That's probably where the important role of intermediaries comes, isn't it? When you get that, you've got that bigger structure up here, these new communities, without an intermediary, so the bridger there in the middle, there's going to be tensions and conflicts and all the problems, but a great intermediary could be so beneficial, couldn't they?
Yeah, that's great. So Bernd, do you have any questions in the chat?
There was just one now when Joss and Fabian were sharing ideas about how do you resolve these tensions? What are means or tools how to go about that? How can organizations get practical about these topics?
Well, I think I'd maybe just continue on that thread. I think it is that intermediary role, isn't it? Because you're almost always going to have that spectrum. If it's a large enough organization, you're going to have that incumbent kind of structure and the leaders, and they have a paradigm, a worldview. If you're a leader and you've got there, you probably had to adopt that paradigm, right? And then you have these new communities and so forth. So I think somehow you've got to have that bridger. You've got to have someone who's able to put their feet in both worlds and able to transpose the value and communicate the value of one to the other and the other to the other, and potentially create spaces or whatever it is for them to start to work together and demonstrate to the incumbent that if you want transformation, it's not going to work through you getting better, just go on doing what you're doing. You're going to have to grow something new, right? And if you could really convince that this is the way to transformation and this is the way for our enterprise to survive in a complex, dynamic, and ever-evolving environment, then I think you have a good business case, so to say, right? And you can start to bridge that divide. But yeah, I think it really is the role of the intermediary to communicate, to connect, to communicate the value and create spaces and ways for them to kind of collaborate and help the enterprise see this as kind of a parent, somewhat child relationship, that this is your next generation, right? And you're not going to go on forever the way you are.
Nice. I think the question from the colleagues was answered with that. If I may add to that, because you mentioned the business case, and Fabian said before clearly, well, one challenge might be that there's no funding for that little island that is evolving. And I think the business case can then be made because within that organization, they know if there is value, how can they go about it, right? It could be sponsors, could be department leads, whatever. I see another question that Azra is bringing. I think it relates well. And that question is, how can you activate the communities with purpose when they are all here as volunteers?
I don't fully understand the question. Maybe Azra could
Yeah.
share a little bit more.
I think I picked this up from your last sentence, Fabian, where you said that communities are a sense of volunteership or something like that. So my question was, how do you actually activate these communities when they're all here with as volunteers? Like, what kind of purpose can you actually deliver to them so they are all here without much nudges and they're contributing?
Is your question like how these groups find purpose, or
how can we actually communicate that purpose or value to them as we bring together as a community?
Ideally, they come together themselves with that, no? And I guess you're supporting that, really, aren't you? And trying to communicate it and clarify it and so forth. Yeah, I'm not sure that is the challenge of people coming voluntarily. The challenge then is how do you grow that and it not just be, because I think the challenge with intrinsic motivation, it has a bit of a hype cycle, doesn't it? And it goes up and it goes down pretty quickly. And unless there's something to sustain it in terms of resources, that's where the problem is, I think, really. Taking that to the next level and growing it is the challenge.
Yeah, I think one thing I would add to that is that Chris Chavez, who is a friend of mine and someone who I respect a lot, he once said, in community, leadership happens by invitation. And I think there's something around, I think communities, especially in organization, ideally happen through making really beautiful invitations that people can totally say no to. And that only the people who really align with that purpose, with that possibility, whatnot, feel called to step into. And I think there's I've seen within organizations, also communities where the invitation is not formulated in a way where it's clear that they can say no to without any consequences. And again, it's that dynamic of like feeling like you should or you have to versus people really being there. And I think part of that is also one of the most important things I've learned about community is that you will never activate 100% of a group. It's just impossible. It's not supposed to be. I think every group I've ever worked with is basically 3 concentric circles where at the core, there's a tiny group of people, I don't know, 5%, depends on like what the group is, who takes responsibility, organizes things. People like, many of you here on the call who organize this call and organize other things. Then around that is a middle circle of the people who actively show up, like many of you at this call today, who come, who participate. And then there's a huge outer circle of people who just kind of surf along and who are opportunistic and who maybe at some point show up and whatnot. And I used to think that was having a big outer circle was because I was a bad community builder or bad community weaver. And that it was my role to convert the third circle into the middle circle. But that never works because of that sense of volunteer and of agency in people to just do it if they want it or not. And instead, I think the focus is on what I've learned is the focus should be on the 2 middle circles, working with the people who show up, working with the people who want to be there, and then making sure that there's invitations for others to show up when they want to, and making sure there's pathways, because actually it turns out that these 3 circles are very liquid and fluid over time. If you look at a community over 10 years, 15 years, the middle circle, people go out, people come in and whatnot, it becomes liquid and fluid.
Maybe I could pick up on one question there. how do you think important like barriers to entry are in those, say, circles and other aspects? You know, certain people would say you have to have people who are making an investment. It can't be too open. If they don't commit anything, then nothing's going to happen. How do you feel about that? It kind of goes to the questions of a question of closeness versus openness, and investment of people and so forth. How do you feel about what do you think about it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I do think that, as again, if you use the concentric circles, as you come closer to the core, I think there should be a higher commitment. There should be a threshold, an ideal and intentional threshold that you should walk over to say, yes, I want to be more actively involved, and I have a sense of what that means. And at the same time, I'm also a big believer that there should be a part of, especially if it's larger groups, where people can actually be there with very low threshold, just allowing that kind of third circle to be there. But that might mean, maybe that's just every 3 months there is a public call, or I think there's some kind of an interplay between having a really relational core that's there and that's committed, and having something at the same time that's very open, but that has a very different rhythm. And I think the other thing, is around rhythm. I do think that I imagine that those three concentric circles have usually very different kind of rhythms of engagement and commitment with that. So I think for me, it's about like finding a mixture of those two.
Yeah, I'll just say briefly, the interesting thing I see, because we are like one of those larger communities, with that big outer circle, right? Many thousands of people there. And a bit like you, I thought, we're going to activate them and bring them in and all of this. But what I have seen, Fabian, an interesting thing is when you do something that's relevant for them, they'll come, and because it's such a large group, you can do quite specific things and you'll get that segment of people, but they'll sit there doing nothing when you do a whole pile of other things that aren't relevant for them. So that's quite an interesting aspect, right? When you have a large enough group, you can start to do quite specific things, and then those very specific people will come to it, right? And they'll probably never come for the next year or 2 years, right? So that's also an aspect of networks, isn't it? Like organizations have a thing of, you kind of show up and you sit there in your office and you're paid 9 to 5 and everyone's there. Whereas a network's kind of voluntary and on demand, and you join when you want to, and you may not join for a year or whatever. So sometimes you can feel like, even in a large network, if you're doing things that aren't relevant for it, no one shows up. And you're like, where is everyone? And then suddenly you do something that's relevant and a whole pile of people come. So you get a lot of fluctuation in kind of networks that we don't really see in normal organizations, because we have that kind of routine, predictable everyone there, which is quite an interesting aspect of it, I find. Yeah.
I love that. I think that's a really beautiful perspective and beautiful example. And again, I think as we zoom out, there's just a lot of, these communities are just very liquid. I think they just move much more, which also, I think on a positive side of that, or maybe liquid can sound both positive and negative, but I think on a positive side, I found that communities and networks are actually surprisingly resilient structures, unless like the leadership burns out, which happens very often, and we can talk more about that. Is that I know a community I've been very closely connected to, at different points lost its funding, lost its leadership, even at some point lost its name, lost its legal structure. Like, give me an organization that can survive that. And why did the community survive? Because there was a web of relationship that wanted to stay together, and it would even stay together without a structure, without funding, without leadership, and then refigured it out. I think there's something really powerful that could be very beneficial for organizations as well to learn to implement.
So, Fabian, so are you saying like there are certain aspects like this funding, and there's a possibility that they can lose the funding, lose the leadership, lose everything. So what are, from your experience or working with different communities, what are some aspects that you see that may not apply for organizations or could have some sort of drawbacks?
I see Joss unmuted, so
Oh, I might say a quick word if you don't mind. An interesting thing you're getting to there is like, well, what actually is the important thing that's holding them together, isn't it? Right? If they can lose all those other things. And one thing I think is, well, one really interesting thing is the water cooler idea, isn't it? That the idea that in an office, you know, everyone sits there separately, but we all have to sometimes go to the water cooler, right? And we collect there. And that's a Schelling point or whatever you want to call it. But we have a need to come back to this space, isn't it? And that's going to make a very resilient community, right? It doesn't matter if this water cooler loses its budget or its leader or whatever, people are going to stay coming back to that water cooler. So you might ask then, okay, that's in some sense what's going to maintain this community and the resilience, isn't it? So what is the water cooler for our community? And it doesn't obviously have to be water. It could be like, I'm a consultant and I need to find new clients. So this is a good place for me to go to find new clients. So I keep on going back there, right? Whether that's a good reason or not, but it's a reason for me to stay going back there and other people to come back there and us to stay bumping into each other. So I think if you don't have that, then you may be quite fragile and be pushing a ball up a hill, you know? So I would maybe start with that question. What's kind of the gravity here, right? The water cooler is the gravity. We have to stay coming back to that. And there's so many different kinds of water coolers, aren't there? What is the water cooler for our community? What's the gravity that's going to have people stay coming back, even when the leader isn't necessarily there organizing everything and there's the budget and everything?
yeah, that's a beautiful question, Joss, and I think you said it. I know I learned a lot from listening to you. You know, what I've learned about like what is that fire, or like we call it the fire in the middle. Like, what is that source of energy and possibility that draws people in? And what I found is that there's in a lot of communities there's a difference between the hook and the anchor almost, where the hook, what draws people in at the beginning, is something very tangible and clear. Like, I want to learn something. I want to learn this. I really fully align with this purpose. I think these are well curated kind of people that I want to connect with, and I think this will, you know, have some kind of benefit for me. But then I found that the most sustainable anchor to keep people there is relationships, and it's actually values. I found that just like people being in environments that have values that truly resonate with them is a huge gift for people. And I found that it's an enormous thing that draws people back and keeps them there because they just believe these are my values. And I think often in organizational structure, I'm not sure if people always, most oftentimes, they don't necessarily buy into the organizational values. And again, this is maybe heavily generalizing. I don't know if that's true as a general statement. Yeah, and again, I think when I think about the anchor, I think it's in the relationships, in the belonging, the care, and the friendships. It's in the values, and of course also if they really believe in the purpose. But this is maybe a provocative things to say, but I found that people join for the purpose, but even if the purpose doesn't fully align with them, they will stay for the relationships and the values even more so than the purpose.
That's indeed very interesting. That goes quite deep, I must say. We have another question here lined up, which I'm not sure it bridges well. We are asking, how is this topic of community weaving reflecting any trends, any broader trends that we can observe today in society or within organizations? Is there a trend? Is there something fancy about the topic as such? But then also, like you spoke before, you know, it goes very deep and it relates to other topics as well. What are you observing, Fabian? What can you see out there? For me, for example, I was tempted to ask before, it sounds a lot as if communities have a purpose like what I would describe activists. And that might be going too far and it brings another word in. But let's have a look first at the trends.
I could say a word, yeah.
Sure.
I think if you talk about, generally trends out there in the world, I think one of them, you could think about Maslow's kind of hierarchy, right? As the world's become a bit wealthier and you have more and more people kind of not having to spend all their days fulfilling their basic needs on production lines and tilling the land. There's more and more people who want something more from work, isn't there? More and more people who want purposeful work and almost expect that to some extent. I mean, you could talk about these generational changes and millennials and Gen Zs and what they want from work and all this, but you definitely hear a lot more, I think, about, people wanting purpose in their work. And I definitely think that around here anyway, in these kinds of economies, a lot of people want work that is both pays the bills and is purposeful, right? And a lot of organizations don't really deliver on that, right? So there's definitely a missing kind of space there, I'd say, around making more purposeful organizations. And you're not going to do that, right, with a kind of industrial age hierarchical system that's optimizing for efficiency and so forth. I mean, they do try, right, to sell us purpose and so forth, but I think people kind of feel that it's not there. So I think the only way to get there is probably to evolve to be more like communities, to really be inclusive in the sense of allowing people to bring in whatever purpose they have and to organize around that in some sense, which wouldn't be a hierarchical structure and those kind of traditional forms of kind of control and so forth and efficiency, but would be more about I'm showing up for this. And yes, I have to do my job and so forth and be effective. But then as part of my work, I care about this, and there are other people here who care about this. Can we do something together that's more than just, business as usual? So I think definitely a lot of people these days want both work, but it to also be purposeful. And I don't think you do that within traditional structures. And I'd say that's a trend that's kind of taking us in this direction. Whether we're responding to that effectively or not, you could definitely question that. But I'd say the potential is there. Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, we've become a lot more aware about the limitations of the whole industrial kind of model, right? Maybe that wasn't there 50, 60 years ago, but now it's pretty acute, right? We're very aware of the problems with our organizations.
Yeah, we fully agree with that. And I think in terms of trends, two more things to add to what Joss was saying is, I think if you talk about providing meaning at work, I think the other thing is just a big trend is like loneliness. People are so more disconnected than ever from each other. And where do people spend most of their time is at work. Like it's literally like one of the biggest times in their lives is people spending time at work. And I think that also just shows the biggest opportunity to really create environments of belonging, of care, of trust. And I recently saw a survey, like some statistics of how many people find their life partner, like romantic partner at work. And I was actually shocked. It's actually very high. It's quite a lot of people. So it's already happening, it's just happening in like, in not necessarily, it's not necessarily curated or supported. And the other trend, I would say, if a lot of our work is with more nonprofit organizations or more purpose-driven organizations. And there, I would say the big trend is, as you all know much better probably than I do, how the focus these days is from let's solve specific problems to let's build systems, let's support systems, let's go about systemic solutions. And what does it mean to create systemic solutions? Well, I think very often creating networks, creating communities, bringing people together in a whole field, in an ecosystem is a core part of that. And I think that's a big development. Now, I think we are right now, with the political the winds are changing, and people are being more scared again, like investing into holistic things. But I do think that consciousness is going from, oh, we just got to solve this problem, to, oh, actually turns out every problem is connected to many other things. So we also should like approach it in more holistic ways, and very often communities and networks are an important part of that.
Yeah, I would note that I would say that if you really wanted a purposeful organization, if you really wanted an organization that was organized around purpose, I mean, first thing, that would look very different from the ones we know, because I don't think there are a lot of those around here. But it would look more like a community. That would be the natural way for you to organize if you really had a purposeful organization. I think it would just start to evolve in that direction naturally. I think we talk a lot about purposeful organizations, but I don't think it really happens, right? I think we quite often stay within structures of control and optimization for efficiency and so forth, that the purpose is somewhere, but it's not really at the top of what that organization is doing. If you change that top in terms of this thing's really organizing around its purpose, I think the structure would really start to evolve massively, and it would, I mean, collaboration would start to really come into it, right? People would actually be showing up to collaborate around this purpose. And then you got to figure out how to pay the bills and how to make this whole thing work and everything. But I think if we really go in that direction, or organizations that do go in that direction naturally start evolving in this way. So if we think these purposeful organizations are on the rise, then that too could be a trend that's kind of taking us in this direction, I might add.
Yeah, and I would say, a radical expression of where these two models come together, in my opinion, is around the cooperative movement. I think cooperatives are, where ownership is really actually distributed among the people who are there, which is both radical for the community to kind of co-own itself, and it's radical for the organizational structure to share power truly. Yeah, I'm a very big fan of that.
Yeah, I think it ultimately goes to like, what is this organization about? Like, why does this thing exist, right? Does it exist for the extraction out of the top, and for those people who kind of manage it and the owners and so forth, or does it exist for its purpose, right? And I think those are starting to clash in the world. I think a lot less of our organizations that say they're purposeful really are. So I think this is something more in the future, right? The actual purposeful organizations are on the fringes. But it does really create a huge question in the organization that may be emerging and evolving in the future of like, really, what's this thing about? Are we here to extract value for those shareholders and to make life good for the management, or are we here for our purpose, right? And I think that's surfacing. Whether we're really having those conversations and really developing purposeful organizations, you could definitely question that, or whether there's a lot of kind of purpose washing going on here. But I think that's emerging, and that's a trend. And if we really went in that purposeful direction, that would lead to a very different organization, a kind of cooperative sort of thing, as you say, where the ownership and so forth is not so much about extraction, but it's really about the purpose and redistribution and so forth.
Yeah, that's a great one. So from, we are talking about organizations that are purpose-driven, and Fabian in the a few minutes ago mentioned about sometimes if they're not aligned on the values or the purpose, they can still stay for the the friendships and the relationships that they build there. So like out of this, from your experiences, do you have any examples that really worked well or failed? And can you explain a little bit more on why?
Examples for
any communities that really work, like the purpose-driven communities that really worked, and when there are people who do not believe in those values, or it's quite possible, right? If they don't believe in the values or the purpose, but they still join, but they stay there for the relationships, in such scenarios, do you have any examples that either worked or failed?
I'm going to interpret your question as in like within organizations. Is that right? Like communities within organizations that where that has happened. Does that sound right?
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of successful small communities within organizations. As Joss was saying, I think there's a lot of successful communities of practice around learning. I think that's just an accepted model, because in the end of the day, currently communities within organizations have to kind of make a business case of how this contributes to the bottom line, which I think is just looking at the model in a too narrow sense, but that often either goes into it helps to drive sales, conversion, retention of customers, where it's on the like marketing brand side, brand communities, or it is on the HRE, like this helps retain people. And I don't know, an example, or makes people happier, retains them, or helps them learn. Those are kind of, I think, understood KPIs from an organization point of view. I think there's many examples there. A beautiful one I just heard a few days ago is, or an organization here in Amsterdam that has a community for young parents, who helps them with a community before they go on maternity leave or paternity leave, and then also a community to welcome them back, because it can be a very challenging phase to both be gone and to come back. And it's a moment where people have a lot of questions, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of stress, and often it can be an issue for organizations when they don't come back, or when so I thought that was a beautiful opportunity to create a community. Just what about you?
Yeah, I was just thinking of Mighty Networks, the community platform we use, and their mantra is that people join communities when they're in periods of transition, not when they're in business as usual, their job. Like in business as usual, our job, we're pretty busy normally, right? But when the example you give there, pregnancy, right? That's a transition period, right? And in those periods, you need to learn about new things. And a good way to do that is with other people who are going through that with you. So that's a period when they say that that's the group you should be focusing on for. Don't find your niche, find your transition. Because those are the people who actually want to come together, right? Instead of your CEOs who are incredibly busy and they don't want anything more on their plate, right? These people who are going through this transition period, like becoming CEOs, right? That's a person who's aspiring somewhere. They need to learn a lot. They want to be with others to learn tips about that and so forth. And then they'll join a community. That's what I'd say. But I mean, just a question back to you, Fabian. Do you feel like there's kind of a glass ceiling to communities in terms of how they grow in organizations or out there in the world, and then kind of get stuck? Why? I mean, a question I always have in the back of my mind: why don't communities kind of rule the world, right? Why are they still these kind of smaller things? Is there a kind of limit to which they hit and then they get stuck, and that's why we can't kind of get to scale? Do you have any thoughts on that?
The biggest reason why communities fail is because the people who run them burn out. And why do they burn out? Because we live in a society where care work, weaving work is not valued, is not appreciated. And I think that's the glass ceiling. I think we live in a cultural narrative that relationships are nice to have, but they're not considered like an essential thing. And I'm sure many of you have heard this notion of like the story of separation versus the story of interbeing, those kind of notions, how our current cultural narrative assumes that everything is totally separate and we all just have to fight our way through, versus cultural narratives when we like are actually all connected, everything is already connected to everything else. And my feeling is that unless these like deeper narratives change of what the value of relationship is, and of if relationship is something we have to create versus we actually already are in relationship, my feeling is that glass ceiling will stay in many cases. And again, I think I just see so many beautiful people who put so much into communities who then burn out because it's not something that collectively at this point we value. We all know it intrinsically, but then collectively, people are like, okay, show me the value in terms of dollars, you know, and that's when that's the wrong, in my opinion, the wrong question to ask.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you, Fabian and Joss. I think we have 3 more minutes left, and I would like to open the floor for the audience to ask some questions if they have any.
I play audience right now, and I would like to ask Fabian about his own value proposition with his team and colleagues. How do you come in? How do you support these organizations? And how do you play basically with, you will have some sort of consulting framework and tools with which you will influence and steer that intrinsic motivation of that community. That's still a bit clashing in my mind, how you will give them structure. Can you explain that a little bit, how that works?
Yeah, Bernard, I think you're right that there is a tension there. And I think our basic approach is that we never do the work. We are just there to support the people who do the work, and we try to strengthen them. We call it accompaniment, where we walk with the people who weave these communities, and we basically try to make sure they are healthy and they are good and they're taken care of. But we're not trying to be the ones who run or actually even solve the problems. And I give you a small example, like when we help communities organize gatherings, we almost never facilitate any of the gatherings itself. But what we do is we help them find people within the community who will run the gatherings, and we help them build the capacity to co-host and co-facilitate. So that's kind of often, I would say, how we've been working with this tension. Yeah, don't know if that actually answers your question, but that's what came up.
No, it does. I felt this is an important aspect to ask. But who else has a last question out there before we? Seems that everybody's quiet.
Well, Deborah's question might be a good one. What's the right question to ask? I don't think we appreciate the value of questions so much, and they come very valuable in the context of communities, I think, because community is an open thing where people are kind of exploring something together, you know, and if you come in with the answer, you're kind of crowding things out. So in managing the SI community or working with the SI community over the past years, I've learned the power and value of questions, right? And wow, they can be amazing. Like before, I never realized like how important questions are, the difference in quality between some questions versus other ones. Some questions they just go nowhere. Other ones is like they ignite things amazingly, you know. So I think that's the right question to ask. What's the right question to ask? You know, what's going to unlock the potential of this group of people and what they care about, and bring them together in trying to collaborate and explore that question and that challenge and learn and maybe co-create around it. And I think you will be amazed by the power of a question if you get it right. And it can be extremely simple, 10 words or something. But in that, if you get the right people, you can unlock incredible potential. So I'll leave you with that one. Maybe Fabian, anything you want to add to them?
Beautifully said, Joss.
Last question from Kim. You want to ask it yourself, Kim, or shall I read it?
No, yeah, sure. I would love to ask it myself. Hey, Fabian, really enjoyed this talk. So much interesting things to dive more into. So my question is, how can we strengthen the collective sense-making within communities and ecosystems? I feel sense-making, understanding our environment is so key. So I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Is your question on like how you strengthen the capacity of a group to do that?
Yeah, I would say in a general sense, the sense making, how can we as a collective, I mean, from an individual standpoint, there's multiple things you can do to be able to sense your environment better. But from a collective kind of point of view, how do we collectively become better at sensing our internal environment, so within the ecosystem and also outside? So yeah, that could be capacity, yeah, but in general sense.
I'm not sure I have the answer, Kim. I think it's a beautiful question.
Yeah.
What I know is that I do think that communities are an amazing place to sense make of the world together. And I think we live in this extremely confusing, disturbing, fast moving world, and having to sense make by yourself, I think leaves a lot of potential on the table. I do think a lot about, for example, what's happening right now with the Trump administration in the last few months. I think there's just so many people who feel overwhelmed, and I think there's a big opportunity for gathering formats, where we can come together in a place of trust and care to just process, to just make sense of what is happening, and how do we pay attention to what's happening, what do we pay attention to, and what are other people paying attention to. And I think there's an opportunity there for formats that are slower, that are more focused on deep listening. I'm a big fan of the circle way, which is basically like you host circles of like just really deeply listening to each other. And I think there's a big opportunity for that.
Yeah, thanks for that. I love that. And I think, listening, that is a key thing. I'm practicing on that all the time. So thank you, Fabian.
Thank you very much, Fabian, for sharing your wisdom with us. We learned a lot. We could see in the chat that there were very precious comments, which was great. Thanks, Joss, for your contribution. Thank you very much, Tripura, and thank you everybody that joined us and asked very beautiful questions. Can I remind you guys all to have a quick look at the Miro board and let us know what your interest in another meeting might be, as well as give us a short feedback how you appreciated this session with Fabian. Fabian, thank you, and thank you everybody who joined us, and hope to see you guys all next time around.
Great. Take care, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Joss. Guys. I feel like I've gotten I got a lot of attention, but also thank you, Joss, for being such a beautiful, conversation partner. And thank you all for organizing, Bernd and Tripura and Asra, and I don't know who else was all involved in the organizing. Thank you. Thanks for creating spaces for such a nice conversation.
Great.
Thanks, Fabian. Thanks, Joss. Thanks, everybody.
Take good care.
Thank you, everyone.